Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the world of European electric vehicles. Specifically, the competition that's been heating up lately between the EU and China.
Sounds good.
We're going to be dissecting an analysis from the European Parliamentary Research Service. It's a fascinating report that really digs into what's at stake and what the future might hold.
Right.
But to kick things off, I have a question for you.
Do it.
Did you know that China is now the world's leading EV producer?
Yeah, they're really pulling ahead. I think they're responsible for over half of all the EVs made globally.
It's a pretty staggering statistic when you think about it. So how did they get there? How did they achieve this level of EV dominance?
It's a really interesting story. Well, a couple of things I would say. First, early government support. Way back in 2009, China was already pouring billions of dollars into subsidies.
Wow.
To incentivize both consumers and manufacturers.
So while other countries were still kind of debating the potential of EVs, China was already going all in.
Exactly, yeah. They were playing the long game while others were just dipping their toes in the water.
Smart.
And it wasn't just about the money. They also recognized very early on the importance of controlling the supply chain.
Oh, yeah, the batteries.
Yeah, so they focused on securing access to all those critical raw materials like lithium and cobalt, which you need for battery production.
So they weren't just building cars, they were building an entire ecosystem.
Precisely, and this allowed them to achieve these huge economies of scale that, most European companies just couldn't match.
Makes sense.
And that's why you see Chinese EVs being so much more affordable in a lot of cases.
Yeah, that explains why companies like BYD have actually overtaken Tesla as the top EV producer globally.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
But what's fascinating is it's not just about undercutting the competition on price. They've also been making waves with their technology.
Absolutely, yeah. You're talking about the Blade battery, right?
Yeah, have you heard of this?
Yeah, it's supposedly safer and more energy dense.
Yeah, it seems like they're really pushing the boundaries. And of course, you can't forget the sheer size of China's domestic market. I mean, having such a vast customer base at home allows them to refine their products and gain experience before even expanding internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge advantage.
So with all that said, how has the EU responded to this sort of EV juggernaut?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, they're definitely grappling with the consequences of China's early lead, and they've launched a major anti-subsidy investigation.
Really?
Yeah, against China. It's actually the largest ever trade case of its kind.
Wow.
And this has led to tariffs being imposed on Chinese EVs entering Europe.
So the EU is basically saying, okay, we need to protect our own industry.
Yeah, exactly. They're arguing that these tariffs are essential to protect European jobs and ensure fair competition, because they claim that Chinese EV manufacturers have benefited from all these unfair government subsidies.
Which gives them an artificial advantage. But imposing tariffs always carries risks, doesn't it? I mean, we're already seeing some pushback from China, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Retaliation is a real concern. For example, French cognac has already been hit with retaliatory tariffs.
Oh, wow.
And there's a lot of worry about the potential impact on German car makers like Volkswagen, who are heavily invested in China.
Yeah, so it's a real balancing act for the EU, isn't it?
Absolutely.
They need to protect their own industries without triggering a full-blown trade war.
Yeah.
And all of this leaves European consumers in a tricky spot. I mean, these tariffs could mean higher prices for Chinese EVs, which potentially makes European brands more competitive. But it also raises the question of choice. Will European consumers have access to the same variety of models and technologies if Chinese EVs become less readily available?
Yeah, those are all really important questions. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Exactly.
So we see how China got ahead and what the EU is doing right now. But the big question is, what happens next? What's the future for European EVs?
Yeah, the analysis we're looking at actually lays out 4 possible scenarios for 2030, each with a very different outcome.
Oh, wow. So like best case, worst case, and everything in between.
Exactly. And let's start with that optimistic outlook, the one they call cutting edge Europe.
Okay.
What does success actually look like in this scenario?
Well, in cutting edge Europe, the EU becomes a global leader in EV innovation and production.
Nice.
So think, European cities where charging stations are as common as gas stations are today.
Oh, wow.
And streets full of these sleek, high-performance European EVs.
So not just catching up to China, but surpassing them.
Exactly. Yeah, this scenario sees European car makers really embracing all the cutting-edge technologies, developing next-gen batteries, and really pushing the boundaries of autonomous driving.
That's awesome, but how do we actually get there? What triggers this transformation?
Well, a key factor is a really strong and decisive policy push.
Okay.
The report actually mentions this idea of a Clean Industrial Act,
Oh, interesting.
similar to what the U.S. did with their Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh, yeah.
So, massive incentives for domestic EV production. We're talking government subsidies, tax breaks, investments in R&D, streamlined regulations, all designed to make Europe the best place in the world to build electric vehicles.
So a pretty radical shift for the EU.
It's bold, but the report argues that it's necessary to level the playing field and give European companies a real shot against those Chinese giants.
And it's not just about the economics, right? This is about environmental leadership as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, in this scenario, the EU actually exceeds its emission reduction targets and becomes a model for sustainable transportation for the whole world.
Yeah, it's a pretty inspiring vision.
It is, but let's be real, not every prediction is quite so rosy.
True.
The report also paints a much bleaker picture with the overdependence scenario.
Oh, that one sounds ominous.
It does. It's like the nightmare scenario for European EVs.
Really? How bad are we talking?
Imagine, walking down a European street in 2030, and it's mostly Chinese brands you see.
Okay.
Sleek, affordable, but hardly any European names.
So are European car makers basically wiped out in this scenario?
Essentially, yeah. It's a death by 1,000 cuts.
Wow.
A combination of factors could lead to this, a slowdown in the EU's green transition, a lack of action to support domestic manufacturing, and those continued price advantages for Chinese EVs.
Right. So European consumers are just naturally drawn to those lower costs and the wider selection, and they just opt for the Chinese models.
Exactly. And it's not just consumers.
Huh?
Imagine European businesses and even governments choosing Chinese EVs for their fleets.
Makes sense.
Simply because of the cost effectiveness and availability.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
So European car makers, saddled with higher costs and a shrinking market share, they just can't compete.
It's a downward spiral.
It is, and it really highlights what's at stake here.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so we've seen the best case and the worst case. Now, let's talk about the middle ground.
Okay.
What happens in the slow electrification scenario?
Well, in this one, the transition to EVs in Europe still happens.
Okay.
But just at a slower pace.
So not as dramatic as the overdependence scenario, but not exactly a victory either.
Right. Chinese car makers still gain a significant foothold in the European market, both through direct exports and by actually setting up production facilities within Europe.
Interesting. So they're in, but they haven't completely taken over. What's the situation for European car makers in this scenario?
It's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some European brands manage to adapt and remain competitive.
Okay.
They invest in new technologies, maybe streamline their production processes,
Yeah.
and potentially form strategic partnerships with Chinese companies.
So survival through adaptation.
Exactly. But unfortunately, some just struggle to keep up.
Yeah.
Maybe hampered by legacy costs, outdated technology, lack of investment, and sadly, some get pushed out of the market entirely.
So a tale of two paths. Some thrive while others struggle to survive.
It happens.
All right, let's move on to that final scenario, and this one feels really relevant given what's happening in the world today. The sanction spiral. This one feels like it could really upend the entire EV market, not just in Europe.
Yeah, that sounds serious. What are we talking about here?
Well, in this scenario, tensions between China and Taiwan escalate and actually lead to a military conflict.
Oh, gosh.
And the U.S. and the EU respond with really severe economic sanctions against China.
Okay. And then things get messy.
Exactly. China retaliates, and one of their targets is the EV supply chain.
Oh, right, because they control so much of those raw materials and components that are needed for battery production.
Exactly. So suddenly that flow of essential materials to Europe gets disrupted.
Oh, wow.
Production lines grind to a halt. Car makers are scrambling to find alternative sources, and the price of EVs just skyrockets.
It sounds chaotic, not just for the car makers, but for anyone who wants to buy an EV.
Exactly.
Even if they could afford it, they might not be able to find one.
It's a stark reminder that even something as simple as choosing a car can be influenced by forces far beyond our control.
Absolutely. And it really underscores the importance of diversifying those supply chains.
Yeah.
Investing in domestic production and fostering strong partnerships with other countries that share our values.
So we've explored these 4 potential futures for European EVs, ranging from, a dominant position to near collapse and even this global supply chain meltdown.
Yeah, quite a range.
But what I'm curious about is what concrete steps can the EU actually take to navigate all of this and actually ensure a future for their EVs?
That's the key question, right? Well, the good news is that this analysis doesn't just lay out these scenarios. It actually offers some pretty practical recommendations.
Oh, good, because I was going to ask, what are the solutions here?
Yeah, so let's shift gears and talk about what the EU can actually do to not just survive, but thrive in this new era of electric vehicles.
Right, so we've seen these potential futures, everything from, European dominance to near collapse and even this global supply chain meltdown. Where do we go from here? What can the EU actually do to shape a positive outcome for European electric vehicles?
Well, the report lays out what it calls a three-pronged strategy: promote, protect, and partner.
Promote, protect, and partner. It sounds like a good approach to, just about anything.
Yeah.
But let's break it down in the context of European EVs. What does promote actually mean here?
It means creating an environment where European EV manufacturing can truly flourish. Think of it like building the ideal ecosystem for innovation and growth.
So what are the key ingredients in this ecosystem?
Well, the report suggests a pretty comprehensive industrial plan. They even call it a Clean Industrial Act, kind of taking a page from the U.S. playbook with their Inflation Reduction Act.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we're talking about a whole suite of incentives and policies, financial support for R&D tax breaks for EV manufacturers, investments in charging infrastructure, streamlined regulations, the whole nine yards.
It sounds like a pretty radical shift for the EU.
Yeah.
Is there an appetite for this level of government intervention?
It's definitely a bold move, but the report argues that it's necessary to level the playing field and give European companies a fighting chance against those Chinese behemoths.
Okay, so promote is about nurturing a strong domestic EV industry. What about protect? Does this mean more tariffs and trade barriers?
Well, tariffs are definitely one tool in the toolbox, but protect is about a broader strategic approach to trade defense. It's about ensuring that Chinese companies aren't benefiting from unfair subsidies or engaging in practices like dumping.
Dumping? Can you explain that a bit further? I'm not sure everyone's familiar with that term.
Sure. Dumping is essentially when a company sells its products in a foreign market at a price that's lower than its production cost, or the price it charges in its domestic market.
Oh, okay.
It's often done to gain market share quickly, even if it means taking a short-term loss.
Right.
But it can be incredibly damaging to domestic industries that can't compete with those artificially low prices.
So the EU needs to make sure it has mechanisms in place to prevent that kind of predatory behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And protect also extends beyond those traditional trade measures. It also encompasses things like cybersecurity.
Oh.
EVs are essentially data gathering machines.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't even thought about that.
So the EU needs to be proactive in setting standards and regulations that protect user data and ensure the security of these connected vehicles.
So we've covered promote and protect. What about that third element, partner? Who is the EU partnering with in this EV race?
Well, partnering is about collaboration not just with other European countries, but also with like-minded nations around the world.
Okay.
The report specifically mentions countries like the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. All of whom have a stake in fostering a competitive and innovative global EV market.
Makes sense. So what does this partnership look like in practice?
It involves things like diversifying supply chains so that the EU isn't overly reliant on any one country, especially China, for those critical raw materials and components.
Right.
It also involves sharing knowledge and best practices, coordinating research and development efforts, and presenting a united front when it comes to setting international standards for EVs.
Strength in numbers. Out of all the policy ideas in the report, one that really stood out to me was this idea of tying EV purchase subsidies to local manufacturing.
Oh yeah, that's a bold one.
It essentially means that if you want to benefit from government incentives to buy an electric vehicle, that vehicle needs to be made in Europe.
Wow, that's a strong message.
It is. What's the thinking behind that?
Well, it's a way to ensure that taxpayer money is being used to support European jobs and stimulate European innovation. It also sends a clear signal to both European and foreign car makers that the EU is serious about building a robust domestic EV industry.
So will European electric vehicles survive? Will they thrive? Or will they perish? We've seen the possibilities, the potential for European leadership, the risk of being overtaken by Chinese competitors, and the disruptive power of global events. The future is still being written, but it's clear that the choices made by policymakers, businesses, and consumers in the coming years will determine which path we take.
You're absolutely right. And this report offers a roadmap, a set of strategic options for the EU to consider. But the ultimate outcome will depend on a complex interplay of factors: technological advancements, geopolitical shifts, market forces, and ultimately the decisions we make as individuals.
It's a fascinating time to be following this EV revolution, and it's clear that Europe is at a critical juncture. The decisions made today will have a profound impact on the future of transportation, the environment, and the global economy. What will the European streets of 2030 look like? Will they be dominated by Chinese brands, or will European carmakers reclaim their place on the road? It's a question that only time will answer. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought and a deeper understanding of the forces at play.
And perhaps it will even inspire you to get involved, whether it's through advocating for supportive policies, making conscious consumer choices, or even pursuing a career in the rapidly evolving field of electric vehicles.
That's a great point. This isn't just about observing from the sidelines. We can all play a role in shaping the future of mobility. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of European electric vehicles. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration of a topic that matters. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring